Hello, everyone. So we live in challenging times. We have a planet that's getting hotter faster than it should be. We have microbes that are evolving resistance to our best drugs. And we have species blinking out of existence before we even get a chance to identify them. I've had this idea bonking around in my brain now for about 44 years as to what we could do about that. And I state it with absolutely zero hyperbole or exaggeration in any way, shape, or form when I say science comics can save the world. Now, I know what you're saying, that's nuts. You might be right. Let me see if I can make my case. The story's going to start in 1974, a trip out west. It was a family trip. There were several locations, apparently. I remember a big hole in the ground, vaguely. There was a mountain that had 4 heads carved in it, I think. But the truth is, there was only one destination that mattered to me, and that was Dinosaur National Monument. At that moment in my life, every thought, every fiber of my being was consumed with dinosaurs. When we were on our way out, we stopped at the famous Wall Drug in South Dakota for some free ice water. And there I saw for the first time a spinner rack. And this was a glorious 4-color carousel of comics. And on that spinner rack, there was a Spider-Man comic. And on that Spider-Man comic, Spider-Man was fighting Stegron the Dinosaur Man. And there was a T-Rex rearing up behind him. And I knew that I had to have that comic. And I begged for that comic. And I suppose that my parents knew that the 20 cents they would spend would purchase them 5 minutes of silence in the back of our brown Chevy Impala as we cruised across the West. In that back seat, I fell into that comic. It had everything I loved. It had dinosaurs, which were science. And science and dinosaurs were sort of equivalencies in my mind. It had adventure, weird characters. And at that time, I had been captivated by comic strips like Peanuts. And this was like comic strips on drugs, on steroids. Panels all over the place, crazy shapes and colors. And as I read that, I didn't realize it at the time. As I said, I realized it 44 years later. A little seed was planted, or maybe it was more like a parasitic infection that took over my brain. And that idea was that science comics could save the world. Well, why does the world need to be saved? What does it need to be saved from? I'm sure we all have our list, and we've heard a number of very important ideas today. I'm a scientist, and so that's my primary concern. So I want to let Carl Sagan say it, who said it best, right? We live in a society exquisitely dependent on science and technology in which hardly anyone knows anything about science and technology. Science is oftentimes treated as if some sort of arcane, magical world, right? And oftentimes the populace feels disconnected from that world. Now, for some, they can gain access through more traditional means, textbooks, lectures, etc. But for a lot, there's an additional gap there, an additional step that has to be made before they can even feel comfortable accessing those traditional means. What I'd like to suggest today is that comics can act as an intermediary, a little trampoline between where they are and where we need to get in order to help learn enough about science to solve some of these big problems. Now, the idea that comics could play an intermediary role between the novice and more traditional means of education was first sort of crystallized for me by a cartoonist named Gene Yang. So Gene is the author of American-Born Chinese, Secret Coders. He's a former computer science teacher, won a whole bunch of awards, but probably most importantly, he has won the MacArthur Genius Award. So he knows what he's talking about. He was the first I saw talk about comics as being an intermediate. And he makes 2 powerful component arguments there, that one of the reasons is because they're so visual. I won't go into all the literature that talks about what visual monkeys we are, but we are. And all you have to do is realize the number of hours you stare at your smartphone to know this is probably the case. The other thing that comics have is the fact that they're permanent. So unlike other media, like movies or videos, you control the rate at which you pass through it. You control whether you linger for a while on something that's challenging, or whether you move through something relatively quickly, or whether you can go back to something you forgot relatively quickly. Now, in my gut, I think I've always sort of known this. I don't really use slides much in class. I prefer to draw at the board. And what my gut has been telling me is that if I draw on the board, my students will draw on their notes. And if they draw on their notes, they'll understand things better. Because for me, that's how I understand the world. To know an eye, I have to draw an eye. I oftentimes will have my students take a step even beyond the note-taking and force them in an uncharacteristic fashion to tell me a story. You have to write and draw a comic story that explains, as Claudia Meyer does here, the hypothalamo-pituitary axis. It can be done, as Claudia deftly demonstrated. What's really exciting is when students who are no longer in your class, who are taking classes elsewhere and are asked to draw something, decide, I'm going to draw it, but I'm going to make it a comic. And then I'm going to show Dr. Hosler, and he's going to take a picture of it, and he's going to put it in his TED Talk. Now, I'm not sure Abby had all of that mapped out when she did this, but I was delighted when she came and showed me her cartoon explanation of an affinity column. This was a big hit with her lab makes and her 2 T's, right? I'm not the first scientist to suggest images and pictures are important for learning. I'm not the first educator who has said that learning is an important and valuable skill, or drawing is an important skill for learning. It's been around for a long time. So what I am here to talk about is the idea of comics. And I would argue that scientists have been using comics for most of the history of science. So here's Galileo Galilei, sort of famous. Here's his comic about the moons of Jupiter. He goes out one night, he draws a circle, right? That's Jupiter, 2 asterisks for moons, then he goes back in. Comes out the next night, draws the panel line, draws Jupiter, 2 moons. They've changed. He keeps doing this, and as you move from top to bottom, you are reading a comic. And what do you learn from that comic? Those moons are moving. That's a revolutionary idea that cannot be visualized any other way, especially at that time. I know what you're saying, well, that's great for communicating science. Super, Jay. What does that have to do with me? Well, I would argue that there are times when you might think comics are incredibly important. So take these crash instructions, for example. Think about what their goal is. Their goal is to teach you something very important, very fast, under highly stressful conditions. That's college, right? When a plane is crashing, that is a simulation of the collegiate experience. They don't pick a block of text to do that. They pick clearly drawn images to lay out what they want you to know. And in fact, it's been the case and demonstrated in ER docs that patients given wound care instructions. So imagine you walk away from the crash plane with your big old gaping hole in your arm, and you go to the ER doc. If he gives you or she gives you instructions with pictures, you are twice as likely to care for that wound appropriately than if you're just given wounds. This is a hole in your arm. You would think you'd be highly motivated, and for some bizarre reason, pictures make you want to do it more. But stringing together pictures is insufficient. It's not enough. It's not enough to coax that person off the ledge if they're not under a plane crash pressure condition. How do we coax them to science? You've got to tell them a story. Today you've heard a bunch of compelling stories. Not laundry lists of facts, but stories that have connected you emotionally. My first experience with the power of stories was after writing and drawing Clan Apis. This was my first book. The organism I studied as a graduate student and as a postdoc was honeybees. So I just wanted to tell a cool comic story about bees because I thought they were cool. It was in no way, shape, or form my intent to do an educational comic. When I started going to conventions and meeting young readers, I was blown away by how much science they had absorbed, internalized. But even more importantly was the fact that they were asking me higher order questions, questions that extended beyond what was inside. And I met, it was 2 years ago at the Smollett Press Expo, 2 young ladies who were in their 20s, just finishing up college, came up to my table, told me that their father read Clan Apis to them, and then they would come back and read it multiple times. And as they're talking about it, they're starting to tear up because they're thinking about, spoilers here, the little bee that dies. Now they're in their mid-20s. They're getting weepy about a cartoon bee. That's the only way you get kids to come back and to read something and to really learn something and internalize it is if they care about it. Now, here's the problem, though, from an educational standpoint. I'm a professor. I love my content. I don't want to give up content. That's a terrible idea. Everything's important, right? Every fact is important. So if I'm going to give up my content, I got to know what am I going to get in exchange. There are a couple things that I think are important. The first, generally speaking, context, character, and comedy. So I could tell you there's a lot of energy in a glucose molecule. I could tell you that you could take a pile of sugar, set it on fire, and you might hold on to that for a while. But that little 8-year-old in the back of that brown Chevy Impala, let me tell you what he would hold on to for a long time. He would hold on to a story in which you have a giant glucose molecule and this little fly named Wilbur who's been warned, be careful, that glucose molecule has a lot of energy in it. He, of course, ignores the warning from Aunt Edna, gets his little mallet, whacks it with all his might, and it blows right up in his face. All that energy released, whoosh, in one go, and then he is left standing in the smoldering remains, and, coincidentally, the CO2 and water given off by the oxidation of glucose, right? That's what the 8-year-old would remember. And you know why? Because that 8-year-old would have gone back to that story time and time again to watch that glucose molecule blow up. And what he wouldn't have known is that as he was doing that, he was internalizing that information. This ultimately became the foundational idea behind a non-majors comic book textbook that I wrote and drew. So I got a grant from the National Science Foundation, and I constructed what I hoped would be a textbook that would act in that intermediary fashion, that would use comics to help bridge a gap in a non-majors class. So the basic structure of the story was, it features Wrinkles the Wonder Brain. He's the lab assistant for the 3 Greya sisters, and his job in the lab is to shuttle their eye between them. He trips, drops the eye in a vat of distilled human imagination, and since they're blind without the eye, he has to go in after it. He goes on to have a series of eye-related adventures. It's more exciting than that sounds. And each of which introduces a basic idea about eye biology, ends on a cliffhanger, but before you can get to that next cartoon chapter, there's a little shorter chapter of text, traditional text, that takes the idea that was introduced, right? The comics acting as an intermediary, takes the idea that's introduced, expands on it, goes a little deeper, and then allows them to go back to a comic. Cool idea. Did it work? Let's see. Well, to test this, what we did was we took a bunch of students of mine, and I made them buy my book, which, you know, I've lived for that moment as a professor. And I said, well, okay, look, this is what we're going to do. I'm going to give you a pre-test before we do this book. I'm going to ask you your opinion on biology, your opinion on comics, and how much you know about the eye. And at the start, during the pre-test, they hated biology, they hated comics, which is heartbreaking, and they didn't know anything about the eye. Okay, great. We used the book for 2 weeks. Then after we finished that unit, we waited 2 weeks, and then I came back and I gave them the same pre-test over again to see if those attitudes and ideas had shifted. Oh man. Number one, they understood the eye better, which is an important thing to point out because the comic didn't make them more stupid, right? You're laughing. This was actually a major concern of one of the reviewers for the grant, that we would be dumbing them down. But more importantly, their attitude about biology went up, improved significantly, and so did their attitude about comics, and they seemed to be connected. When I asked the students informally, they said, yeah, I read the comic chapters a couple times. Not the text ones, but the comic ones, which I thought was progress, right? The second thing that giving up content for makes room for is a sense of wonder. There is a reason why I spent 4 years, or 3 years, it felt like 4 years, 3 years as a postdoc training bees for 5 hours a day, sitting in the same chair. It was tedious, but it was my tedious. It was the tedious I liked, and it was the tedium I could do because I felt a certain sense of wonder. It's the thing that drives scientists. So if I want kids to have a sense of science, I have to give them a sense of wonder to go along with it. So in 2011, I wrote a book. I didn't illustrate this one, and my wife Lisa says it's the best looking book I've ever done. I'm just kidding. With Kevin Cannon and Xander Cannon. And it's a story about an alien scientist who's giving a tour of a holographic museum of Earth evolution that he has built for his king. And as they're moving through the history of life, the little 8-year-old inside me as I'm writing realizes that the Mesozoic period is coming up. And so I said in the notes, in the script, I said to Kevin and Xander, you know, this has got to be, we're going to turn page 7, and there's going to be 2 pages of dinosaurs. And Kevin and Xander were like, yes. And the editor was like, no, no. And we said, yes. And we just said it louder, and the editor said, okay. And so when you turn that page, there is this glorious image of dinosaurs everywhere. And I have had kids come up to me at shows and say, I look at that page and I wander around with my eye and I explore and I see new things and I ask questions and I say, yes, just like a scientist. And they came back to it time and time again because it filled them with wonder. So let me wrap up here by saying a couple things about this. The first is, any scientist will tell you that kids are natural scientists. And any artist will tell you kids are natural artists. And any parent will tell you kids are natural storytellers. But at some point, we make them go to different rooms to learn these things. At some point, we pull those things apart in their mind. But when they're young, those things are just 3 facets of human creativity. The call to action here is twofold. The first is, I think publishers and creators have to start thinking differently about the way we educate science. I think we have to expand our definitions to say, you know what, we can use fictional elements to explain nonfiction, to excite wonder. The other thing is that we have to start encouraging kids to do this. Now, I've had teachers say to me, I can't do comics. I don't know what they are. And I say to them, don't worry, the kids do. The kids will do it. They're not afraid. And when they do put those 3 elements back together, when we help them do that, they will see the world and understand the world better. They are the ones that are going to save the world. And comics can help them do it. Thank you.